So, what if you woke up one morning and the news was just completely dominated by one story? A world leader had been captured overnight, not by their own people, but by a foreign military in a lightning fast raid. Well, that's exactly what happened in January 2026. This one single event sent these incredible shockwaves across the entire globe, and it really forced all of us to rethink what we thought we knew about power, politics, and the rules of the game. In this explainer, we are going to break down Operation Absolute Resolve. Our story starts in the middle of the night. It's about 2 in the morning local time when the skies over Caracas, Venezuela just erupt in explosions. U.S. airstrikes begin, one by one, taking out Venezuelan air defenses, basically clearing a path for what was about to happen. For the people living in the capital, it was the beginning of a day that nobody could have ever imagined. To really get to the why of all this, you have to hear it from the man who ordered the whole operation. This quote from President Donald Trump, which he gave after the raid, it just cuts right to the heart of one of the main motivations his administration talked about. It frames this whole conflict not just as a political thing, but as them taking back something they truly believed was theirs. Okay, so with that motivation fresh in our minds, let's dive into how this operation actually went down on the ground. This wasn't some haphazard strike. This was a meticulously planned military operation, and it was designed for two things: speed and overwhelming force. So the mission gets a code name, Operation Absolute Resolve, and it had this laser-focused objective: capture President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. After those initial airstrikes basically punched a hole in the defenses, the elite Delta Force went in. It was an incredibly fast and decisive ground assault on Maduro's residence. And believe it or not, within hours, the couple was in U.S. custody, already on a plane headed for New York. Now, when you look at the human cost, the numbers tell a really stark story, a real military imbalance. You had over 50 Venezuelan and Cuban personnel killed, plus, tragically, 2 civilians. And on the U.S. side, 0 fatalities, just a handful of injuries. I mean, that lopsided outcome really just underscores the massive technological and tactical advantage the U.S. forces had here. An operation of this scale, I mean, it doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? The raid on January 3rd was really just the boiling point after a very long simmer. So, let's rewind the clock and trace the events that led right up to this dramatic moment. Looking back at the year 2025, you can just see this clear pattern of escalating pressure. It wasn't one single event, but this methodical tightening of the vice. It starts with a military buildup and covert surveillance. Then it moves to striking alleged drug boats, then seizing oil tankers. The U.S. was systematically just cornering the Maduro regime. And the final warning shot? It came on January 2nd, with a public announcement that strikes were imminent. And this brings us to probably the most complicated question of all. Why? Why do this? The administration gave the world a few different reasons, some of them overlapping, and some of them, well, they seemed to conflict with each other. So, on the one hand, you had the official legal justification. Maduro and his wife had been indicted for narco-terrorism, and they were being brought to justice in a U.S. court. Simple as that. But then on the other hand, President Trump was incredibly candid about a resource motive, speaking really openly about taking control of Venezuela's huge oil reserves, not to mention its gold and rare earth minerals. But hold on, there's another layer to this whole story, one that suggests this might not have been a purely external operation. The question analysts started asking almost immediately was, did the U.S. have help from the inside? And the evidence for this inside job theory, well, it's pretty compelling. Reports started surfacing that Maduro's own vice president was involved in secret talks to plan for a post-Maduro government. You add to that President Trump's own description of her as cooperative, and then you look at the incredibly smooth transfer of power that happened right after. It all fueled this widespread speculation that some kind of inside deal was made. The impact of this raid went so far beyond Venezuela's borders. It sent shockwaves through the entire international community, creating these deep, deep divisions among global powers and pretty much forcing every nation to pick a side. Domestically, inside Venezuela, the transition was clinical. That's the best word for it. With Maduro gone, the country's Supreme Court immediately ordered Vice President Rodriguez to take over. The military fell in line right away. And just 2 days after the raid, she was formally sworn in. There was no power vacuum, no chaos in the streets. It was just done. The international reaction, though, was anything but orderly. It was like the world split right in two. You had Russia, China, and a lot of Venezuela's Latin American neighbors, like Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, all strongly condemning the action. At the same time, the Venezuelan diaspora and some key U.S. allies were literally celebrating. And then, caught in the middle, you had major European powers like France and Germany just calling for calm, clearly very uneasy with the precedent this whole thing was set. Okay, and this is where the story gets really interesting. The financial markets. You'd think a military operation in a huge oil producing country would send oil prices through the roof, right? But they barely moved, just a tiny 1% bump. The real story was in Venezuelan government bonds. These things, which had been basically worthless for years, surged a mind blowing 30%. The market was making a huge bet that a new US backed government would be very, very good for business. All right, so let's pull back from the immediate events. What are the bigger, long term implications here? How did this one operation fundamentally change the global game? This is where we get into the really big ideas. To try and make sense of this, analysts coined a brand new term, the Putinization of U.S. foreign policy. Sounds pretty intense, right? But in simple terms, it just means that the U.S. was adopting a much more aggressive might makes right approach in its own backyard, prioritizing its own interests way above international law, kind of like what Russia has been accused of doing for years in its own sphere of influence. And this raid wasn't just a one-off. It was seen as the first real-world test of a new foreign policy doctrine. Some started calling it the Trump corollary. This strategy, which was laid out in a 2025 memo, was all about reasserting American dominance in the Western Hemisphere and, this is the key part, locking out competitors like China from the region's valuable resources. You can almost think of it as a 21st century hyper-aggressive update to the old Monroe Doctrine. One analyst, Ryan Berg, I think he captured the gravity of the whole situation perfectly by quoting Churchill. He said, "This raid wasn't the end of the story, but rather the end of the beginning. It was marking the start of a brand new, and frankly, a much more unpredictable chapter in global affairs." And so, that leaves us with the big, central question we're all still grappling with. Was Operation Absolute Resolve a necessary, if controversial, move to take down a hostile narco-state? Or did it signal the dawn of a new, more aggressive era of American foreign policy, one driven by a return to good old-fashioned resource imperialism? The answer to that question is still being written, and honestly, it's probably going to shape global politics for decades to come.